Hello and welcome back. We're now going to take a look at task two, where we create the application load balancer. Now, be aware that you can do multiple parts of this in different order. So in another lab, you might create the autoscale group first. Uh, in this case, we're going to do the application load balancer so that it's prepared and ready when we launch the autoscale group in the EC2 instances. We'll be able to launch it and attach it to the application load balancer all kind of seamlessly. We'll take a look at the other models later. So what is a load balancer? Well, this tool is essentially allowing us to create a front end in the public subnets so that traffic can be sent to that. And so you're going to see that we'll have a DNS name for the load balancer, which will actually represent listeners that are created in the subnets, the public subnets, or wherever we define the load balancer to reside. So the load balancer can actually reside in more than two availability zones, but it's typical that you have at least two availability zones to balance the traffic because we want to go provide high availability in the event of a data center disruption in an availability zone. We're still functional in another availability zone without us having to intervene. So we're going to set this up in advance, right? So let's take a look here at what we're going to do. If we come down here, you can see that we're going to be launching it in the public subnets. So we'll scroll down here and take a look at the instructions. So what we're going to need to do is go to the EC2 console and create our load balancer. So let's jump over there now. So you can see we currently have an instance that we're going to use later on by extracting an AMI from it. And we'll use that with the auto scale group. We're going to go ahead and come down here to load balancing and we'll click on that. And then I'm going to go ahead and hide this part here. And let me go ahead and zoom in a little bit here. It'll look a little better this way. And we'll go ahead and create the load balancer. So you can see there's three different types of load balancers. We're going to focus on the application load balancer, which allows for connections on HTTP and HTTPS. So when traffic is targeted at our application, it will get sent to the load balancer's DNS. The load balancer will make the connection to the client, the external requester outside of our VPC. So that requester never connects directly with our web server, which allows us a much more secure environment. And so we're going to need to set up a target group and rules about what the target group does when it receives traffic. And we're going to do that in this process. I'll go ahead and hit the create, and I'll go ahead and name this. Okay. Inventory load balancer. It's internet facing. You can have an internal load balancer if you wanted to put a load balancer between two auto scale groups of EC2 instances. So you might separate the work between different sets of EC2 instances, and you need traffic from one auto scale group to go to another auto scale group. That would be an internal. We're doing the internet facing. We're going to use IPv4. Notice it does support IPv6. And then what we need to do is tell it to use the appropriate VPC. Notice that only two availability zones are showing as available. That's based upon the fact that we have subnets in two different availability zones in this VPC. So it doesn't show the other ones. I'll go ahead and click on that. And we want to make sure this says public subnet. Sometimes it will, sometimes it won't. So you always have to check it. So easy to make the mistake of placing your target in the wrong subnet, and then it wouldn't receive traffic. It's very important that we put this as the front end in the public subnet. If we place the load balancer in a private subnet, then it wouldn't receive traffic, right? Because anything in a private subnet is not going to receive external traffic, or if it does, it's not going to be able to respond to it because it won't have a route out, right? So public subnet only for these. And then it looks like we may have to create a security group because we didn't see one earlier. So according to the instructions, we'll We'll scroll down here. We're going to create a security group. We're going to name that inventory LB. And we'll enable web access to the load balancer. So that means we're going to need HTTP, which is port 80, anywhere IPv4, but we're also going to set it up to allow for HTTPS. Now in our lab environment, we can't support that because we don't have a certificate that we can apply to this so that it can do the encryption and authentication, et cetera. But we can still set up the rules. It's best practice to use HTTPS, so it gives us a chance to practice that. So let's go ahead. Now, what's great is I don't have to go anywhere else to create my security group because I have a handy link here. So you'll notice that what the security group I need isn't listed. So I'm going to be creating that. And so I'll click on the create a security group. Go and apply the name. And I'll go ahead and put that description in there. And let's make sure we have the correct VPC. There it is. Now I'll set my inbound rule. And so this should be HTTP. And I can do all zeros. This and this is basically the same thing. It's just two different ways to do that. And then I need to set up an HTTPS rule. Okay, so we'll add another rule. And I may have to scroll down to find that. One of the cool things is you can start typing into here. And there it is. I want that one. Confirm is port 443. Same thing. I want anywhere IPv4. In this case, they're not having us to describe the inbound rules. I'll just double check that because sometimes if you don't do that, it kicks back at you. Okay. We don't need to. It's just a little extra. We don't need to do anything with the outbound rules because if you recall, any traffic that is allowed in, these are stateful. So any traffic that's allowed in through the inbound rules does not need a corresponding outbound rule. There's nothing we need to do with that. So I can just click on the create security group, let it complete the creation. When I return, and this is the important part, I'm not done here, right? I was redirected to create a security group. Now I'm going back to my other tab. And if I don't see it in here, I would need to hit the refresh. I do see it, but that refresh button will make sure you can see it. I want the inventory load balancer. I want to deselect the default. Okay. Now here's where we establish the listeners. Now, a listener is basically a process. It's checking for connection requests from the load balancer using a port and protocol. And we can see it. We're only going to use HTTP 80. So yes, we set up HTTPS 443, but we don't have a certificate. So even though we're using that in the security group, we're allowing that traffic through without a certificate, the web server would not be able to decrypt it. So we're not going to worry about that for this, but in practice, you would want that. We're going to leave this as is, right? And down here, we need to set up a target group because we won't have one. We're going to create one. So once again, we can use this link they provided for creating a target group. Let's look at the details of the target group. Okay. Now, we're going to specify some group details. We're going to name it. So let's get the name now. The target will be instances. So we can see that there are other types of targets because you can target IP addresses. So the load balancer can send traffic to, if you just have IP addresses, right? Maybe they're fixed and you want it to send to those, You can have it send traffic to Lambda functions. You can have it send it to another application load balancer. We're going to leave it on the default. Here's the name using HTTP port 80. Notice that this time it already picked up that it's lab VPC. That would make sense since this is going to be specifically aligned to the load balancer. So we don't have to tell it what load balancer. We'll pick it from the load balancer from the target groups list. Now we have some health checking and et cetera that we can do. Let's see if there's any details on here that we need to do anything with that. In the health check section, there's some advanced health check settings. Now the load balancer will automatically perform health checks on the instances. This ensures that they're responding to the requests. That's really important because if they're no longer responding to the request, the load balancer should mark them as essentially dead, right? Doesn't matter what's really happening on there. If it cannot receive the request from the load balancer, then there is no purpose to that instance, right? So the default settings are usually good, but we're going to need to speed that up for the lab purposes. Otherwise, we're going to have to wait around a while. So we'll set our healthy threshold to 2 and our interval to 10 seconds. So let's go take a look and see what that's all about. So if I open up the advanced health check settings, so this is the number of consecutive health check successes required before considering an unhealthy target healthy. So this is, hey, we're going from unhealthy because somehow or other it wasn't responding to, okay, great. We got at least 2 consecutive health check successes, right? So we're going to set this to 2 so that it can fail healthy quicker, right? And then the other thing is, on the interval, this is the approximate amount of time between health checks. So we want a shorter interval. 30 seconds usually good, but we're going to have it do it more frequently. That does increase costs in production. So you're really going to be mindful how much health checking you want going on, how frequently you should be checking on that. Okay, these are individual health checks that are sent to each EC2 instance. All right. I think that's all we're going to want on this page, and then we'll take a look at the registering targets. So let's scroll to that. We'll hit next. Now, we don't really have any targets yet because we haven't set up our autoscale group. The autoscale group will contain all the EC2 instances that will be targets for an incoming traffic. This is the existing web server that we're going to use to get an AMI so we can create some targets. So we can skip this. In fact, we have to skip it. And at this stage, it looks like we are pretty much there, all right? So we can just go ahead and create it. We've created the target group, okay? And you can see that we can get to our application load balancer now, right? So coming back over here, and that's the part you have to remember, is all we did is we set up the target group. And we can see that in the panel over here that we do have in the target groups, one that's already been created, right? It's ready to roll. It's not been associated to a load balancer. There have been no instances associated to it. So it's just waiting to be used. So we'll come back over here. Now, if I don't see the target group in my list, I'm going to refresh this and take a look. And there it is. Okay. Now there's some additional options for things like target group stickiness, etc. You can see that we can associate this or integrate the load balancer with CloudFront and with the web application firewall. So that would give us additional protection using this combination, or if you just wanted the web application firewall, there's a global accelerator. So there's lots of options. Here's the summary. We can see that it's mapped to this VPC, and these are the 2 availability zones in the public subnets. This is the security group. This is the listener rule. Hey, listen on port 80. We're going to forward it to a target group. Okay. If we take a look down here, pretty much no additional settings. So all we're going to do now at this stage is go ahead and create the load balancer. And there you have it. We now have a load balancer that is associated to a target group. The next stage in task 3, we're going to create the auto scaling group, which will allow us to deploy the EC2 instances, and they will be associated after that process with the target group, which will be associated with the load balancer, and you should be able to then interact with the application. All right, we'll see you in the next video.